go ahead and record this. And so what we're going to do is talk about some of the real important advantages we have in a modern society, despite the fact that things are really rough right now. And they are. We won't pretend they're not. They are. But there's light at the end of the tunnel. And some of you in that last assignment chose to write about the vaccine instead of looking up the answers about the Romans. Well, that was fine. And those that wrote that did a great job. But also, I made this an option in my political science class for their semester. And wow, I got some of the best essays I've ever seen. Now, let me give you a little secret 2 years from now. When you're in my poli-sci class, I have a thing called early turn-in. And I allow everybody to turn in their papers, their research papers, which is the biggest part of their grade. I let them turn it in early. And that early turn-in allows me to go through them. And if I see that they're missing some things that are important, or they're making a lot of grammar mistakes, or making a lot of capitalization errors, that kind of thing, I can send them a little note, tell them what to fix, and they can send it back for full credit. Now, that's really important. So it's called early turn-in. We're not going to do that here because we don't have, a research paper. I'm not asking you to do one this semester. But 2 years from now, make sure you turn in your papers early turn-in. It's a big way to make sure that you get an A on that paper. And I had, well, let's see, out of 84 students, I had 48 turn them in early, which was last night at midnight. So I've learned so much from those papers. They are brilliant. The thing about UCAS that's so important is you guys are great writers. And that's why I wanted to give you a few essays here at the end to write, like on the triumvirate and a little bit about maybe the vaccine if you wanted to do that. So you'd have a chance to write, because this is one of the great strengths of this school, is that when we ask you to do a college level research paper, you guys have the writing skills. So pay attention in your English class as a word of advice when they teach you the MLA format, because you're going to have to use that format to put your paper into so it looks beautiful and it's really perfect by the time you turn it in. So pay attention when they're teaching you MLA. You're going to need it for my class. You'll probably need it next year too. And then you're going to have to do a really amazing research paper. And if you haven't done that last study guide and you're still thinking about it, you might want to write about the vaccine. And I want to show you, look, this all ties in to modern history. All right. In fact, let me do the setup this way instead, and I'll play the little videos as we come through. Let me do it this way instead. So here we were in the medieval period. I'm going to cue up the screen here, share the screen. Okay, perfect. And then let's go in and talk about this a little bit. So last time we were talking about some of the things that weakened the Byzantine Empire, right? And we talked about how they were being invaded all the time, and the Western Empire especially, and how they had to fight off these invasions in the East. But then we also talked about political instability and how, we need a stable government. I think that's a lesson for us today. We've gone through 4 years of instability. The government just hasn't worked that well. Now we have a chance for a new start, and that new start's happening in 50 days when Joe Biden becomes next president of the United States. And he's going to rebuild all of the healthcare things that were in place before that got somehow removed just when this pandemic hit. So we kind of set ourselves up for failure there. And so when we get to this situation, right, we're unable to deal with things like plagues as well as we should. And so when we look at Justinian's plague and the death toll it took, we talked about how lucky we are to live in modern times. That because, it's only been since World War II that we get the hospital structures that we have today. I mean, when I was a kid, right? I mean, we didn't even really have insurance programs for healthcare. Healthcare was kind of a new thing. It's a real new thing, healthcare around the world. England didn't get national healthcare till 1947. That's when they started. They were the first country to say, we're going to give healthcare to every citizen of England, right? They were the first to do it. Japan followed suit, Germany, so on. We still haven't done that. We're way behind the rest of the world when it comes to giving health care to every citizen as a right of being an American. We have a long ways to go there. So we have a lot of building and a lot of improving and a lot of things to do. But luckily for us, we have the technologies to do it. And so I'm going to kind of play this clip and show you kind of the state where we're at, and then talk about this miracle vaccine situation that is just unbelievable. Now, before I do that, I want to say that England was the first to approve a vaccine, and England will start vaccinating its residents coming up next week. So they were the first to do it. Europe's ahead of us on all this. Like when you took who's creating the vaccines, this BioNTech was working with Pfizer. These two companies working together. This is a huge German company. We know that Moderna is working with Lonza, which is a big Swiss company. So we're talking about world history here, the world reacting. And so they're getting it first. We're a little behind that. And the manufacturing of it, most of our vaccines and medicines that we take today in America are made in either China or India. That's because that's what they do. They have manufacturing plants and that they do this kind of work. And we don't really focus on that as much as we should. Maybe that'll change under the Biden administration. Maybe we'll, as taxpayers, maybe pay, for certain factories that can make vaccines and so on. So we don't have to so much depend on the world supply. But the number one supplier of drugs to the world is China. And China, who sequenced the genome in the first place for this virus and made it possible for us to have testing and all that, is part of this worldwide distribution system that began, of course, with Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus, where the ships are moving constantly and now, of course, by air. So let's go ahead and take a look at our state of affairs first and talk about how we now have 6 different candidates, 6 different vaccines seeking approval through the Food and Drug Administration to be given to Americans. All right. On the world level, each country has to do that same thing. And so you have this big company like BioNTech and Pfizer, and they submit all the data to all these different countries. They have entire teams doing nothing. There's 172 countries in this consortium to decide of how all of the, they're only going to be able to make maybe 500, 600 million doses. Which countries get those doses? They don't all come here. We got to buy for them. We got to bid. So there's a system in place by the World Health Organization as part of the UN to see how, if we can get those vaccines distributed equitably across the planet. And we also have countries like China that is making their own version of the vaccine. They're very technologically oriented. They have a great medical system. They have a lot of really smart doctors. They're going to have their own vaccine, and they're going to start shipping that to the world. And they may actually start doing it for free to different countries like Ethiopia and so on. So it's really a great story of how the world's coming together to solve a big, big problem. Let's look at our own situation first, and then we'll jump to this example with China helping out. Here we go.
Deaths per minute. Put another way, 30 more people.
Okay, I back it up to the start.
Before reminding us all of the stakes. The country averaging 1 COVID death per minute. Put another way, 30 more people dead by the end of this program. Miguel Almaguer leads our coverage.
Today on a CDC live stream, some of the nation's top doctors voting on which Americans should be first to get vaccinated. Frontline workers like doctors, nurses, and support staff caring for the infected are the top priority. Those living and working in nursing homes are also in phase 1A. Together, both groups account for roughly 24 million people, likely exceeding the number of potential doses available by the end of this month.
As you get into January, February, and March, you will then get the second, third, and fourth level of people who are essential to society.
With 6 vaccine candidates aiming for FDA emergency authorization, the CDC has not yet voted on who should get the next round of doses. Perhaps those with underlying medical conditions, critical workers like those in the food supply system, and seniors. Many Americans will likely have to wait until spring.
When the vaccines arrive for distribution, ultimately it's up to each individual state to decide who gets the first doses, though many will follow CDC guidance.
While help is on the way, tonight a record number of Americans are infected and hospitalized. Several states are planning or have already opened field hospitals.
A lot of grief for us as healthcare providers when there's just nothing more you can do for somebody.
As 1 American dies every minute from COVID, New York City is now advising older adults and those with underlying health conditions to limit outside activities.
That was the last thing I ever said to my dad, was I love you, stop crying.
In Chicago, Erica Lopez's father, Lupe, could have been among the early Americans to get a vaccine as a police dispatcher. His funeral was Monday.
My dad taught me so much about life, but never how to live without him.
Tonight, heartbreak and hope. As more Americans die, millions could soon be saved. Miguel Almaguer, NBC News.
This is Stephanie Gosk. The FDA commissioner called to the White House today. Chief of Staff Mark Meadows wanted to know why vaccine authorization is taking so long. According to someone familiar with the purpose of the visit, it happened as some states are scrambling to come up with a distribution plan, while others have been working on a plan for months.
They're all over the map.
The Kaiser Family Foundation reviewed every state's interim plan in a study released 2 weeks ago.
If you had to give the states a grade at this point in the process, what would that grade be? The grade would mostly be A for effort.
Well, that's not good when you give an A for effort. Ouch. Here's the thing with the United States. We don't have a centralized plan right now. The CDC has been underfunded, been under attack for the last political season. Not good, but that's changing. And the states now have got to be the ones that set up the distribution. So we got to find out in Utah how many we get and then who gets it first. And so it's going to be a slow rollout. So by the time the production around the world gets in place and it's shipped to the United States and then shipped to Utah and shipped to our hospitals, all that logistics has got to be figured out. And so the states have to step up. So the governor of the state of Utah, for example, has got to do that. Now, let me show you how a country that is stepping up, and that's China. China has already built the infrastructure to ship the vaccines that they're creating, and they're creating their own, right? And so to everywhere in the world. And look at the preparation they're going into to do that right now. So here we go. Remember we talked about it early. Where did everybody want to go? Where did Vasco da Gama want to get to? Want to get to India and China. Where was Columbus heading to? He wanted to get to China. Why? That's where all the good stuff is. And that's where all the good stuff is still being made. And they're colossal countries with huge manufacturing capacities. And so we trade and we interact with them. So let's kind of see how China is getting prepared to ship a vaccine, maybe as early as next week.
You're looking at one of the cargo jets that will soon be taking vaccines that are approved here in China, made by Chinese biotech companies, to the rest of the world. This one is a charter, Ethiopian Cargo. It's their pharma wing. Look over here. You can see they're already loading up some of the PPE, some of the face masks, some of the hazmat-like suits. Inside, however, they have built an infrastructure that is temperature and climate controlled. Why does that matter? Well, as soon as the vaccines are approved, they have to be kept at a certain temperature setting. And that is the only way they can be transferred from start here in Shenzhen in southern China to finish. For this aircraft, it continues on to the Middle East. One thing that's important to note is the logo on the side, China now. That is a part of Alibaba. It's their logistics and distribution part. Normally, they're doing goods that people are buying.
Let me explain who Alibaba is. Alibaba is the Chinese version of Amazon, and it's much, much, much bigger. It's on another level beyond Amazon. Obviously, they have a bigger country. I don't know how international Amazon has become. They need to become more international, I would bet. But Alibaba is prepared now to ship vaccines all over the world, and they've created these special containers and special planes, and they're outfitting them, getting them all ready. So that vaccine, and by the way, they're the biggest manufacturer of personal protective equipment for hospitals, China is. And so they're shipping it all over. And here's Ethiopia, one of the poorest countries in the world, right? They're helping Ethiopia. They're helping other countries all over the world. This is gaining them a lot of support and recognition around the world. They literally are becoming the international economic leader. And they're using this COVID crisis to kind of show their economic power and their economic muscle and their ability, their science and their technology. And so it's a real transformation in world history, going from a European-centric world to an Asia-centric world. Here we go.
Online. Think of Amazon, but on a massive scale. That is a company that here in China is helping with the distribution of vaccines as soon as they're given the go-ahead.
We are ready to move the vaccines.
Sinow CEO Wan Lin says the company is now adding more routes for greater global reach.
We are not still quite sure about the exact demand on that, but we are definitely...
Okay, Wan Lin is the Jeff Bezos of China, but he has a much bigger company. And he's getting everything ready. So as soon as the Chinese government approves the vaccine that they're creating in China, it's a different ones than we'll be probably getting, they're going to make them ready for the world. This is pretty cool stuff. China, of course, you know, their infrastructure, their rail systems and everything else are just far superior to us right now. They're just really taking the lead. And it, as you know, from world history, it's a lead they had in the ancient past as well. So as we go to the regularly scheduled lecture, welcome to the modern world, but also welcome to the post-European world and North American world. What we're dealing with is a change. The history we're teaching you is the history of Western Europe and how we came about as a reflection of Western Europe. We talked about, for example, I'll do a quick review here as we get set up, but the geography and everything of Europe made them want to go out to sea to explore new places, despite the smallness of their ships to begin with. They had some political structures like the Roman Catholic Church that was kind of holding a kind of a European-wide culture together, even though it was all fragmented in different kings and things. And of course, last time we talked about the monasteries and the convents, and I think we got to where we were talking about how after Pope Gregory the First, around 600 CE, he realized that all these pagans, these Germanic tribes that had taken over the Roman Empire, they had their own religion, and rather than just condemn them, right, and say, oh, that's terrible, you're awful, you're evil, you know, that kind of thing, he said, why don't we just kind of take some of the things that they find important and not so much merge the theological aspects of it, but at least we can respect their practices. So for example, if they worship in this particular place, why don't we build our church there? Do the simple things like that. I love his quote, "It is certainly impossible to eradicate all errors from obstinate minds and at a stroke. And whoever wishes to climb a mountaintop gradually, step by step, and not in one leap." So let's take it slow. And I meant to get a picture of Canterbury Cathedral, I could, but this was a worship site in England for a long, long time. And they decided, well, let's just build a nice church there. And so the people kind of warmed up to it. And then we talked about how, I need to show you Canterbury Cathedral. Let me see if I can get a picture of that up for you right now. So it's just such a beautiful place. It's the head of the Anglican Church now, which broke away from the Catholic Church, but it used to be a Catholic church. Okay, Canterbury Cathedral. It's truly one of the great churches in all of England. It's just gorgeous, and it's really old, and it's really, really cool. And here's what it looks like inside, and you can see pictures of it. This is where the Canterbury Tales were written, because people were going on pilgrimage, right? And they would leave England and they'd come here because this had become a sacred worship site. It was for the pagans. Now it's a Christian site, and they would share stories. And that's where the Canterbury Tales come from. So you guys in your literature classes will learn about the Canterbury Tales before they crossed over into Europe and went to visit other sacred sites in the Roman Catholic Church. It was kind of a form of, I don't know, going on vacation, if you will. You didn't go to Disneyland, you went to Canterbury Cathedral. And if you could afford it, you went to the Vatican in Rome. And if you could afford it, right, you traveled to the Holy Land. You traveled to Jerusalem. You went to the holy sites. You might only do this once in your life, but it was a big thing. Some Byzantine leaders, one wife particular of an emperor, travels to the Holy Land and brings back what she thinks are relics from the time of Christ, and takes it to the holy city of Constantinople, including fragments of the cross. You've heard about the Holy Grail, all those kinds of things. But there were also then apostles and saints and that kind of thing who would pass away, and their bones were kept as relics. And these bones ended up in different churches all over. So you might find somebody said, oh, this is the femur of St. Peter, okay? And it might be somewhere in Germany. And so people would travel to see these relics and whatever. So it was kind of an interesting kind of thing. But people still traveled, for religious pilgrimage. And one of the jumping off places in England would have been Canterbury Cathedral. If you're ever in England, go see it. It's just great. Okay, well, back to the storyline. So then what we see is an awful lot of what we call missionary work going on. And we talked last time, I think, in most classes, but I think some classes I left this out, is that Palladius came from Gaul, went to Ireland, and started to convert people. So Ireland actually got Christianity before the island of England, right? But the most famous missionary was St. Patrick, and we celebrate St. Patrick's Day today. If you have any Irish blood in you, like our next president, Joe Biden, he's Irish, Catholic. Celebrate St. Patrick's Day. He was kidnapped as a kid. I'm going to give you the brief story here. So if you've heard it before, bear with me because some haven't. And this is at the time when Roman Britain is collapsing and it's being attacked by these sea raiders. And he gets swept up in this. And then finally, after 6 years, escapes, goes to, how do you say it? He converts while he's a slave, prays 100 times a day. When he escapes, he goes and gets theological education in Gaul, in France today, and then becomes a priest and is called back to the islands to preach. And he's the guy that's credited with converting all of Ireland to Roman Christianity. And it's mostly a Roman Catholic country to this day. Boniface and others would do the same thing in different parts of Germany. And I wanted to give this example too, because the pagans would often wear medals around their necks, right? They started with charms and amulets. And so Christians adopted that and started to wear things around their necks too, symbols of Christianity. And you see a lot of people still wear jewelry that has Christian symbols on it. Islam does it the same. Most religions do. Okay, so that's kind of what happens. All right, well, now we're going to switch gears a little bit. It's really important now that we understand. Okay, so we're talking about the effectiveness of the Christian religion in order to grow and establish itself and to bring some sort of order and civilized civility, ethics and values to Western Europe. But the political system has deteriorated into a very much more local type thing. So here comes a tribe. Tribe comes in, kicks the Romans out. Roman legion now goes away, doesn't exist anymore. So these warriors, these warlords take over, and they take over the estates and the lands that once were occupied by Romans. And the people that they brought with them, many of them, or the slaves they managed to capture, whatever, began to work the land on their behalf. So these warlords turned into nobility. Interesting switch, right? Warlord to a nobleman. What a nobleman is somebody who owns the land that other people live on, and they owe him their work, their taxes. So this system called feudalism, right, has basically weak monarchies. So France maybe had a weak monarchy, but the real power was in these local barons. And these local rulers were often referred to as lord. Now, I find this a very presumptive kind of title. Lord, I'm thinking Lord God. So basically what this person is saying is that I am like God here in this area. Well, that's exactly what they were saying. And you had to treat them as if they were a God. You know that idea of deification? This is kind of deification on a lighter level, but it's still, the point is, you owe respect to that leader because he's your Lord. Might have a fancy title like Duke or Prince or whatever. But if you were living in the area, you became a vassal. And that's kind of the key term for today, a vassal. And you had to pay homage and you had to pay respect to these noblemen who were lords over the common people. Now you see why modern society is so different. And we talk about this in political science, so I'm not going to talk about it here, but how we went from this type of government to a representative democracy like we have today, where the people rule, kind of a big deal. Because these people are basically saying, God put me in this position after they converted to Christianity, and dare any of you question it. You had to pay homage, literally get on your knees. And if they liked you, they could make you a knight or something and give you land that you then could work and make money and pay them even more. So it was kind of like a pyramid scheme, if you will, of land ownership. And you owed them service or labor. So if you were a fighting person, a nobleman who had knights, those knights, they provided military protection and military force and even a police force. And sometimes they'd be tax collectors. And if you were a vassal, you had to pay taxes to the Lord. The Lord maybe had to pay taxes to a king. Depends on the country. Sometimes, though, they wouldn't pay in money because they didn't have any, because they weren't minting coins like they were in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire minted coins by the millions of coins. You can still find them all over the place. They're still buried places. No more coins. You traded grain. They would have fish ponds. You had to get permission to fish in the fish pond from the Lord. If there were deer running around the forest near your home, you couldn't shoot them. They belonged to the Lord. This is why when you watch Robin Hood movies, in one of the famous scenes is one of the poor people starving. He shoots a deer and he's trying to sneak it home and gets caught. And it was a death penalty offense in some places. But so you had to pay taxes. You had to also, if you grew grain, give a certain portion to the Lord. And the only place you could grind it into flour was in the mill supplied by the Lord. And you had to give a certain percentage of that to them too. This feudalism worked because they had gone to a local economy and everybody still was kind of in it together. So you had to have a system that would work. And so in order to pay the Lord and to pay the police, basically the military protection, and also keep a church local so you could have that religious experience and the ethical teachings of the priest, the peasants, the vassals had to do the service. So here you are, it starts with the vassals. They grew the food. They supplied all this, that, you know, they even made weapons. They even built castles. And so when you look at this hierarchy, it was a very structured hierarchy. The villeins in France, villains, were the lower class. Isn't that nice? So here you are, the lower class. The vassals were the lower class. The villeins, the villains. That's where villains come from. Anyway, the knights were above them. The barons were above them. And the king was maybe above them. And so let's kind of look at the structure. The king granted lands to the barons. The barons granted land to the knights. The knights granted lands to the villeins, who grew crops, who then, we'll go back here again, who provided food and services to the knights, who provided protection and military service and food and money to the barons, who provided moon all the way up. So this is the structure of feudalism. And it's based on an economy system called manorialism, where there's only so much land and it's divided up for certain purposes. Some is left in forests, some is left for hunting, some are left, you know, they would have fish ponds and things like that, lakes and streams. But then they also had places for villages, for the villagers to live. And they also had places for the rich noblemen to live and the castles and so on. And they really ran these estates effectively. Agriculture was actually getting better during this time period. Did you hear me there? Agriculture is getting better. They're learning how to hybridize new plants. They're learning how to basically make new species or better species of sheep, of different types of animals and so on. So it's not like everything stopped, but it changed. And there was very little surplus here to trade. If there was some minor trade, but trade was really gone compared to what it was under Rome. All right, so legal and economic power rested with the Lord. The obligations of the serfs and the peasants, the French called them corvées, villeins, peasants, serfs. Basically, they rarely had money, and they had to offer up part of their crops and whatever to the Lord and manor. All right, now let's just jump ahead. We could call this a big protection racket. We're going to let you work this land, and oh, by the way, if you don't pay a certain amount of tax, we're going to come and, you know, we're the military, you beat you up. Okay. So it was kind of like an extortion racket, like in some places, like a criminal enterprise. You know, you live on this land by my authority and you do what I say, and I'm going to send people out to pick on you if you don't. Not exactly fun. All right, by the 10th century, though, basically, well, that's too much. We'll skip this right here. We'll skip this. What happens with the Black Death, though, is interesting. Now listen very carefully. So we're going to go back to the Black Death. What happened there, I hope it's not back too far. Where did it go? Ah, there it is. What happened here is that two things had happened. One is the climate got warmer. So after several centuries of cooler climate, the economy improves simply because the climate improved. And then what happened? The Black Death hit. And when the Black Death hit, guess what? There's less workers. There's less people to work the fields. There's less people to push around. There's less people to order about. So labor became more prized. And as a result, the poorer classes got more rights. They were able to push for more rights because they were more valuable. In a sense, because there were less to do the work, the amount they were able to keep got higher. And then what happened too is little towns and cities started to spring up. And some of the peasants would move there and they'd pick up crafts and they'd learn to do make things, and they started their own economy within the city. And the city was outside of the power of the local baron or nobleman. And they kind of ran themselves. And so what we see is the economy starts to change. One, smaller workforce. Two, better climate. Three, the rise of little towns and cities that starts to challenge the authority of these warlords. Turn to nobility. Okay, so I'm kind of simplifying the story here a little bit, but not by much. I mean, if you understood what I just said, you'll understand that, yeah, it was a pretty interesting system called feudalism. Now, here's the thing. A lot of the areas that were given to like knights and so on were called fiefs, and they were called fiefdoms, right? So it was like a little tiny kingdom in a big estate that was part of a bigger country. So these local knights felt like they had some control and power. Now, these knights, of course, created a culture, a military culture. They were in a sense like the Spartans. They were training all the time. And they would hold these tournaments, jousting tournaments and fighting tournaments to practice their skills. And so that's when you see, you know, I don't know if you've ever been to like Vegas, they have one in LA near Disneyland. And that is the Tournament of Kings, they call it, where you actually sit down and you have a big meal while they do a joust. And they have these horses running back and forth. It's great fun. But they would have done this for sport. People would have watched, but they're also practicing for a time of war. So that became kind of an interesting little thing. Now also too, this whole idea of a vassal, right? In fact, I'm going to skip this part. You don't need to know that. Well, a vassal preaching fealty or loyalty to the lord above them. Even homage. Now there's two levels. Homage is like total obedience. Fealty is, yeah, I'm loyal to you, but not quite to the same level. So what you would have is you'd have barons that would maybe have homage to one person above them, but only fealty to others. So here's the thing. One could swear fealty to many different overlords and get different lands and different holdings and different rights from different powerful leaders. Wow. But one of the things that you could do was commit military service to the lord above you. And that's going to become very important as we jump ahead, and I am going to jump ahead to the Crusades. Because how did the kings, for example, Charles Martel, get enough forces together to defeat an Islamic invasion of France? He pulled on these loyalty relationships. He said, you owe me military service. And the guy next to him said, well, this guy owes me military service. And well, he owes me military service. So this is how they were able to pull together an army big enough, because their own little group might only be 10 or 15 knights. That's not enough to defeat a Muslim army coming into France. But if you could pull on these loyalty relationships, the idea of my vassals need to come up with the soldiers that they promised, you could create quite a sizable army. And so by the time we get to the Crusades, Western European knights, because of all this, they managed to put together a fighting force of maybe as many as 100,000, which was huge by medieval times. It was even big in Roman times. All right, well, okay, so here's the Frankish king, Charles Martel, fights a battle, right, and pushes the Muslims back over the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain. Now, what would happen is then some of these leaders at the top managed to create what we now call kingdoms. This is the beginning of the rise of what we call nation states or countries today. Nations are a new invention. They're part of modern history. And it's watching how this develops in medieval times that we get to the arrival of countries like France and England and the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese that were able to basically colonize the rest of the world coming out of Western Europe. Countries are funny inventions. Basically, here's the thing. Feudalism doesn't have enough power to exert any authority beyond their local borders. But if you can pull on all these relationships and create an army big enough and loyalty enough, you can create a bigger entity. It's not an empire, but it's something smaller than an empire, but it still has what we call critical mass. There's enough people to exert some real power and authority, like send an army off to the Crusades to fight in the Holy Land, or to send troops to the Americas to conquer the Americas, to go to other parts of the world like India and take it over. So we're seeing right here the beginning of that process of turning Western Europe from an empire down to local little feudal states to countries that are going to start to emerge. And it didn't happen all at once. It was like they get close to a country and then it would collapse again and then close to a country. And a good example is this guy. Here's Pippin the Short, right? He managed to get control of all of this area. Great, except for one small problem. When he died, his three sons divided it all up. And so it split apart. Now, Pippin was interesting, though, is he decides that he needs to give some land and money to the Pope, to the church, out of respect. He wanted to go to heaven, I suppose. And so the church becomes, before this is over, the biggest landowner in Europe, not just because of Pippin, because other people do the same thing. A nobleman worried about his future in the afterlife might give his entire estate to a monastery or to a church. So we suddenly see now the church starts to accumulate land. And around Rome, the Pope actually gets given to him his own country that spans across this. It's not just the little Vatican, which is small, but it spans across all of central Italy. So these are called the Papal States. And because of the donation of Pippin, when he died and his empire collapsed, there you go. The next guy to try to piece it all back together was Charlemagne. And Charlemagne was a warlord. He was constantly at battle, but he also was able to bring the central part of Europe together into what we would kind of recognize today as a country, right? Now, he does something different. In the year 800, he decides he needs the imperator of the Roman Catholic Church. Because though Rome hasn't existed for 300 years, the memory of Rome is still there. So he needs to be crowned as an emperor would be crowned. So who does he go to do it? He travels to the Pope in Rome, and the Pope puts the crown on his head and gives him the divine right to rule. You understand what I'm saying here? Because one of the things we're going to fight the American Revolution over is whether or not kings have the divine right to rule. This is when that divine right to rule starts to get established. That God is ordaining Charles king, and he was Charles the Great, which in Latin is Carlos Mangus, which means in English we translate it Charlemagne, Charles the Great. All right, well, this is the empire that he had there in the light green. And there were some others outside of that. They had these things called marches. Like there's a Spanish march. There'd be a bunch of them around here. The marches were land given to local barons to be buffer zones between them and whoever might attack the central part of his kingdom. And so that was kind of interesting how that all played out. But at any rate, here's the Papal States. You can see it. Look at all this land was given by Pippin to the Pope, right? That's his new country. So the Pope is now a king too over his own little kingdom. The Lombards had come in, the Bavarians had come in, the Saxony was established. Now, Charlemagne, once again, here's the problem. The problem is when he dies, this splits up. This was called the Holy Roman Empire. Well, first of all, it's not an empire, and it's not holy the way they acted. In fact, it's often said the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But it is the beginning of this idea of countries developing. All right. All right. Well, now let's switch topics a little bit. So you see Charlemagne, same thing. It's going to be split apart. Then it's going to grow back together. And eventually, after many backs and forth, we see the beginnings of a France, of a Spain, a bunch of little German states that won't come together till modern times in 1870. But England, 7 little divided kingdoms fighting against each other all the time, merge into England and then conquer the neighbors to the north, Scotland, and conquer the neighbors to the west, which is Wales, and then eventually conquer Ireland too and create what we call the United Kingdom, uniting the kingdoms of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. That's why it's called the United Kingdom. It's where we get the idea of the United States, because we did the same thing. We just united all the colonies into one country. Well, let's talk about what changes now. What's going to lead us to this modern world? The weather improves. From 1000 to 1300. Plus, they came up with a new plow, a plow that was more efficient, a moldboard plow, where you pull it along. And you can kind of see how here's some of the early kind of drawings of plows, and these kind of are more like rakes. They go back over the soil and break up the big clumps in that so you can farm it better. But this moldboard plow allowed the dirt to come off the side and to fall this way, so you could push through the soil with your horse a little bit faster and plow more efficiently. The horseshoe is really important. If you're pulling plows and that through fields, horses, they have tender feet. I don't know if you know this or not, but they're kind of tender. And so they learned to do metal iron horseshoes. And this was an invention that came out of Central Asia. This is what the horse archers were figured out. If their horses were going to attack a Roman legion, they better not have soft shoes. And so they learned how to shoe horses. If you've ever watched somebody shoe a horse, it's really kind of fun to watch. Anyway, never mind. The horse collar, which allowed, you see one right here, here's in the medieval times, they're using this horse collar to pull, right? This plow. That was invented in China and found its way through the Muslim empire to Western Europe. This 3-field system was actually kind of an improvement from the Roman 2-field system. What they learned in agriculture, see this one I said earlier, improvements in agriculture are happening. Agriculture is getting more efficient. They realized if they planted the same crop in the same place year after year, the yields went down. But if they rotated the crops and planted in 3 fields and kept moving around like this, and allow grass to grow here and another crop to grow here, and another crop, and then switch it, that the productivity stayed up. So they could plant in areas that were not being flooded by rivers. Do you understand how important that is? And then they also figured out that manure is great. And they had plenty of it with their sheep and their cattle and their horses. And that would be used to fertilize the soil. So they're learning how to get great agriculture outside of the river systems, which is important. Water mills. This was a Roman invention that then found its way all the way through Europe. And then windmills came from Persian, and they might have been a Chinese invention, but windmills are important. And you see in so many places, windmills turn a thing and maybe grind grain. Water mills can do the same thing. Wheelbarrow, very important in agriculture. That was a Chinese invention that found its way through the Muslim empire to Western Europe. So they're learning how to do agriculture better. And then what we have is a bounce back. After what we basically would say 300 or 400 years of the Muslims growing, that tide slows down and the Christians begin to push back, especially in Spain. And this is an event we call the Reconquista. It starts with the Spanish March, which we just talked about, right? Which was the buffer zone between the Arab Spain and Charlemagne's kingdom. And they start a 750-year war to reclaim this peninsula for Christianity. That ends, as I told you before, in 1492. And that was what freed Spain, which is now have been forged as a nation, the first real nation in Europe, to push their resources toward the New World. They had to win this battle first. And so you could say 1492 was a watershed moment. Now, during all this, though, these people now living in Europe, the Germanic tribes that had taken over, now they were being attacked themselves by other vicious people who were coming from the north. And these are called Vikings. And we're looking at, what are we looking at? There probably 400 years of Viking raids. And the Vikings had these wonderful ships that could go anywhere. They were even exploring as far as Iceland and Greenland and Newfoundland with their ships. And they were beautifully designed, but fast. And they could also go up rivers. They were shallow drafts, so they go up rivers. They took their ships all the way through the river systems of Russia. And it would be the Rus, the people with red hair, that would establish the state of Russia along the Volga River. These were very tough raiders. And a lot of them then, after they kind of cleared the area, sometimes they just moved in and settled down. The Viking raids. All right, well, there's a lot of chaos still is what we're saying. And I'm not going to get into the details of some of this right now. I don't think that's important for the time we've got. We'd spend more time if we had more lectures, but we don't. So we're going to jump ahead now. What about the Byzantines? Well, the Byzantine Empire was hanging by a thread. The Byzantine Empire had really been diminished over time from the Arab attacks, and now from the Mongol attacks, and now from the Turkish attacks. And the Turks basically had taken over all of this area, and they were camped right outside of Constantinople. Constantinople, on the other side of the Bosphorus here, they still held, and that city was considered impregnable, but their power is gone. Egypt's gone. There's some trade. I mean, they're still living okay, but they're finding themselves diminished. But they are kind of a wall between the Muslim world and Christianity further inland. So there's still a very important wall, if you will. Now, with all of this going on, the people in Constantinople, the new emperor asked for help from the West. Maybe he would want to rethink having done that, because he goes to the Pope, Urban II, who takes him up on it. And he travels to France, to Gaul, and he convinces these Christian knights, their lords, that they should mount an armed attack against the Muslims in the Holy Land, and in a sense, preserve the Christian city of Constantinople. Okay, so this is how the First Crusade gets started. Byzantium now had done really well for about 500 years, but now they find themselves really in a tight pinch. Ask other Christians, different types of Christians, Roman Christians, not Orthodox Christians, for help. Well, the First Crusades begin, and some lead noblemen who had a lot of vassals, they built these big armies, and they went on the First Crusade. And they fought some horrendous battles. I mean, how they pull this off, you'll never know. It's just the shock of value of these troops coming from France, basically, and hitting this area. The Muslims are going, oh my goodness. And they were in disarray themselves. They were kind of fighting amongst themselves, so they weren't really prepared for this attack. The Byzantines would feed them. They even paid them at first. The idea is when the Latin armies conquered, like Antioch and other cities along the way to Jerusalem, the Holy Land, which was the ultimate target, that land would be given back to the Byzantine Empire. No, these Latin Christians aren't going to give it up. They're going to turn them into Latin kingdoms. And so we get this attack, and I wish we could show you more, but this is a great drawing, right, of one of the attack. You get some special stories too, like the Knights Templar that gets started. They became guards basically of the roads leading to Jerusalem for pilgrims on those pilgrim crusades, going on vacation, going to the Holy Land to pick up relics and to worship. And so this first crusade, while brutal, was successful. They took Jerusalem, Edessa, and Antioch, 3 of the key cities, right? Now, there's going to be more than a dozen crusades, but there's 4 major ones that we need to talk about, right? The second crusade took some land as well. So the first crusade was the most successful. The second crusade was slightly successful, but by the time we get to the third crusade, it's all going to fall apart. The third crusade was more of a publicity thing for 3 great kings. Frederick Barbarossa, who would end up drowned. He was a German king. The French king, Philip Augustus, and the English king, Richard the Lionheart. And the rivalry between them caused it to fail. So I think that's probably a good place to stop, because you know what happens next. The Crusades lead to people hungry for spices, which leads to modern trade, which leads to Columbus, which leads to Vasco da Gama, which leads to China, which leads to the infrastructure that is giving us the vaccine we have today. Everything today starts with those crusades and the learning of Western Europe about where the good stuff is and how they can use their ships to sneak around the Muslim Empire and to conquer territory themselves, but to also revolutionize the world's infrastructure, the economic systems like this today that are bringing vaccines to the world. It's a great story. And I hope we're doing it justice. Okay, you got one more lecture left, right? Okay, so we'll have a study guide out on Monday. I'll have all your grades updated by Sunday night, and then we'll have one more study guide, and then you're done. If you've done all your work up until now, this is the class that should be the least stressful in your schedule. If you've kept up with the study guides, one more study guide to go. We'll have a study day next week, and then we're done on December 11th. And then you'll have hopefully some time for your other finals. Do well. Raise your hand one more time if you got astronomy. Get an A. Work hard on that one. Make sure you make that one work first. First priority on your list, and then work on the others. English, math, biology, and then my classes at the tail end of it. Okay? All right. You guys, good luck to y'all. Next 2 weeks, it's a big deal, right? Go through finals week at UCAS, it's a big deal. So good luck to y'all.